Hello students, today we have to deal with the topic marriage as a principal theme of the novel titled Emma. Today we have to focus on theme of matrimony. As I have already informed regarding this, that I will take your coming class about the theme of marriage in the novel Emma. So let's start. In fact, there are so many themes in the novel Emma, such as themes of matrimony, theme of influence and interference, moral themes, theme of humor and irony, and so on. But today we will focus on the theme of matrimony as the principal theme of the novel. So let's start. The principal theme of her novel is matrimony. She is preoccupied with the business of making matches for her heroines. Generally, the heroine, after a few false starts, meets the right man, and a series of misunderstandings and frustration occur to delay but never to prevent their union. Morning calls, dinner parties, dances, shopping, expeditions, wedding, etc. are the principal ingredients of her stories. It would be very close to the truth to say that the novel Emma is about marriage, whether the emphasis is upon marriage greed, or upon marriage snobbery, or upon the marriage of true minds, or upon marriage as an ordeal. The fact remains that marriage constitutes a leading theme in the novel, and it is next in importance only to the central theme, which is the education of Emma, the central character. In other words, we may affirm that the education of Emma is depicted in the novel in relation mainly to the most important relationship in human life, namely the marriage relationship. In the very opening chapter, we find Emma setting herself up as a matchmaker. She claims that it was she who brought about the matrimonial alliance between Miss Taylor and Mr. Weston. Even though Mr. Knightley refutes this claim, she clings to it and laughs away Mr. Knightley's objection. Upon her father's urging her to make no more matches, which according to him are silly things, Emma replies that she has to make one more match, and that she must now look for a suitable wife for Mr. Elton, who has already spent one whole year in Highbury, and who has fitted up his house so comfortably that he must now get a life partner. Mr. Knightley thereupon expresses the view that Mr. Elton should be able to look after himself, and that Emma need not bother about him. The next 15 or 16 chapters of the novel are devoted to an account of Emma's earnest efforts to bring about a match between Mr. Elton and the girl Harriet Smith, whom she has taken under her protection. Apart from this However, the subject of marriage figures in these chapters in other ways also. For instance, chapter 2 gives us an account of the marriage of Mr. Weston with Miss Churchill, in opposition to the wishes of Miss Churchill's guardians, her brother and her sister-in-law. The death of Mr. Weston's wife 3 years after the marriage and the adoption of Mr. Weston's son Frank by Mr. and Mrs. Churchill, who are Frank's uncle and aunt. Finding that Harriet is somewhat interested in Robert Martin, Emma resolves to wean Harriet away from the Martin family, and she does so effectively. Emma will learn from a conversation between Mr. Knightley and the new Mrs. Weston is not interested in marriage for herself. According to Mr. Knightley, Emma always declares that she will never marry. But Mr. Knightley also says that Emma has not so far met any man for whom she can care. And Mr. Knightley adds, it would not be a bad thing for her to be very much in love with a proper object. I should like to see Emma in love and in some doubt of a return. These words are an unconscious prophecy. Emma is quite hopeful with regard to her plan about making a match between Mr. Elton and Harriet. This the entire conduct of Mr. Elton seems to Emma to indicate his interest in Miss Harriet, especially Mr. Elton's offer to carry Harriet's portrait to London to have it framed. When, therefore, Harriet receives a written proposal of marriage from Robert Martin, Emma manipulates a refusal by Harriet, to the great disappointment of Mr. Knightley, who had fully approved of Robert Martin's intention. There is there is almost a heated discussion between Emma and Mr. Knightley regarding Harriet's prospects of marriage to Mr. Elton. In Mr. Knightley's opinion, Mr. Elton is not the kind of man who will marry a girl in Harriet's circumstances, because Mr. Elton knows the value of a good income and will therefore like to marry a woman who can bring him a good dowry. Mr. Knightley also points out to Emma the danger of raising Harriet's hopes and aspirations unduly. Vanity working on a weak head produces every sort of mischief, he says. But all this advice has no effect on Emma, who continues with her plan about Miss Harriet. In the course of a conversation with Harriet, Emma says that she herself has no intention to marry. If I were to marry, I must expect to repent it, says Emma. She says that she has never been in love and that without love it is foolish to marry. It is rather surprising that a woman who is so keen to make matches between other people should herself be so indifferent to marriage. In the light of what ultimately happens, Emma's denial of any intention to marry becomes ironical, of course. In the meantime, Emma finds Mr. Elton to be rather slow about declaring his love to Harriet, in spite of the opportunities she creates for Mr. Elton to have private conversations with Harriet. Mr. Elton gives no sign of making a proposal of marriage to her. Emma thinks that he is a very cautious man, advancing inch by inch and making sure of his ground. When her brother in law suggests that Mr. Elton is in love with Emma, she dismisses the suggestion summarily. I assure you, you are quite mistaken, she says to her brother in law, adding, Mr. Elton and I are very good friends and nothing more. Then comes a shock for Emma in the house of a drive back home from dinner at Randall's. Mr. Elton begins to make love to Emma, thus taking her completely by surprise. On Emma's protest, Mr. Elton further surprises her by saying that he had always been in love with Emma and that he had never regarded Harriet as a possible wife for himself. Thus, Emma's matchmaking project ends in disaster. We are now introduced to some more characters in the novel. They include Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax. At first, Emma thinks of Frank as a possible husband for herself, but in course of time she finds that she is not in love with that young man. She then plans a match between Frank and Harriet because she still thinks that she has to manage the affairs of Harriet, whom she treats as her protege. Emma also asks herself if Highbury can offer a suitable husband to Jane Fairfax, but she finds that there is no one in Highbury fit to marry that girl. Highbury afforded no young man worthy of giving Jane independence, nobody that Emma could wish to scheme about for her. Then comes the news that Mr. Elton has got engaged to a certain Miss Augusta Hawkins and that the marriage will take place soon. Emma's reaction to the news is Mr. Elton is going to be married. He will have everybody's wishes for his happiness. Mr. Elton is now a very happy man. He had gone from Highbury to Bath for a brief stay, and when he comes back, he looks gay and self satisfied because his would be wife is to bring him a dowry of £10,000. The wedding is to be no distant event because because the parties have not to seek anybody's permission or approval. Emma feels sorry only because Harriet's sentiments will deeply be hurt by Mr. Elton's marriage to another woman. Okay, guys, I wish to conclude my lecture here with I will continue with the same topic in your next class. So, till then, goodbye and have a nice day.